Don't come any closer. He's not a pet." The words carried across the waiting room like a warning shot, flat, practiced, the kind of voice that expected to be obeyed. Sergeant Dorian Crews didn't look up when he said it. He didn't need to. He'd said it enough times that he could deliver it to the floor tiles and it would still land. Calamestri heard him. She heard the dog, too. The low, steady sound coming from the Belgian Malinois at the end of Crews' leather lead was not quite a growl and not quite a whine. It lived somewhere in between, the sound an animal makes when it has been frightened so many times that fear and aggression have stopped being separate things. She recognized that sound. She had heard it before in a different place, under a different sky, with blood on her hands and a flashlight clenched in her teeth. She turned back to her desk and said nothing. The Coastal K-9 Recovery Clinic sat 8 miles from the main gate at Oceana Naval Air Station in a low brick building that smelled like industrial cleaner and dog and something herbal that the clinic director, a woman named Dr. Opal Fenwick, full name, 62 years old, 3 decades in animal rehabilitation, burned in a diffuser near the intake desk to keep high-strung animals from spinning up the moment they walked through the door. It did not always work. Today it was not working at all. Mako had been pacing since they brought him in. Not pacing the way bored dogs paced. He was moving in the specific, tight, repetitive circuit of an animal whose nervous system had been rewired by sustained trauma. A short arc, 4 steps left, 4 steps right, head low, ears flat, eyes tracking every person in the room without ever settling on any of them. A Belgian Malinois at peak physical condition, 71 pounds, 4 years old, black muzzle and a tan coat that caught the fluorescent light like hammered copper. Under normal circumstances, Calla would have called him beautiful. Under these circumstances, she was more focused on the tension in his haunches and the way his weight kept shifting toward his hind quarters, which meant he was preparing. Preparing for what? She wasn't sure yet. That was the thing about PTSD and working dogs. You didn't always know the trigger until the trigger happened. Crews sat in the plastic chair nearest the door with his feet flat on the floor and his elbows on his knees, holding the lead with both hands the way someone holds a fire hose. He was built like someone had designed a man specifically for the purpose of carrying heavy things over rough terrain, wide through the shoulders, compact, all of it dense and useful. The kind of man who took up space without meaning to. He was in civilian clothes, dark jeans, gray t-shirt with the sleeves cut off. But he sat like he was in uniform, spine straight, jaw set. His eyes moved through the room in the same systematic pattern they probably moved through every room he entered, categorizing everything by threat level. The other people in the waiting room had already moved their chairs back without being asked. A woman with a golden retriever on her lap had relocated to the far corner. A teenage boy with a rabbit in a carrier had pressed himself against the wall near the water fountain. Nobody said anything. They just quietly rearranged themselves around the man and his dog the way people rearrange themselves around weather. Calla brought out the intake paperwork and crossed to the front desk. She had been a veterinary rehabilitation technician for 4 years, and before that she had spent 6 years as a Navy corpsman, and before that she had been a girl from outside Flagstaff, Arizona, who was good at staying calm in situations that made other people fall apart. That quality had followed her through 2 deployments, 1 field dressing under active fire, and now 4 years of coaxing damaged animals back toward something that resembled peace. She was 31 years old, and she had a small scar on her left forearm that she sometimes forgot was there until someone asked about it. "Mr. Crews," she said, not walking toward him, just making contact from a distance the way you would with the dog. "I'm Calamestri. I'll be working with Mako today. I just need to ask you a few questions before we get started." Crews looked up. He had the kind of face that had been outdoors for a long time, weathered around the eyes, jaw sharp, expression calibrated to neutral. He looked at her the way men who had spent a long time in command positions looked at people who were new to them, sizing, categorizing, deciding. "He doesn't do well with strangers," Crews said. It wasn't hostile. It was just information he was delivering, the way you'd tell someone about a road closure. "I understand." She kept her voice even. She wrote something on the intake clipboard. "How long has he been showing the avoidance behavior?" 4 months. Since the last deployment? A pause. Since we got back, yeah. Was there a specific incident, or was it gradual? Crews' jaw tightened. It was gradual. He looked back at Mako, who had stopped pacing for a moment and was standing still, staring at nothing in particular, with the hollow focus of an animal watching something no one else could see. He was fine over there. He was better over there. Coming back was harder. Kala wrote that down. She had heard that before too, and not only from animals. Dr. Fenwick appeared from the back hallway and gestured to her from across the room, a small tilt of the head that meant the assessment room was ready. Kala nodded. "We're going to bring him back to do the intake assessment," she said. "Just Mako and me, if that's all right with you." Crews stood up, all the way up. He was several inches taller than her, and she watched him decide something, not whether to refuse, but how to frame the refusal. "I don't leave him alone with people he doesn't know," he said. "Not unkindly, just absolutely." "That's okay," she said. "You can wait in the observation area." Something shifted in his expression. Not much, but she caught it. He had been expecting to fight about this, and she had just handed him something that wasn't a fight. "Fine," he said. The assessment room was painted a soft gray-green, the kind of color that wasn't trying to do anything except exist quietly. There was no table. Kala worked on the floor. That was her rule, one she'd established when she took the job, over the mild protest of the clinic's previous director, who had believed that putting a human being on the floor with a reactive animal was poor risk management. Kala had been politely unmoved. If she was asking an animal to come to her level, she needed to actually be at their level. Crews stood behind the observation window with his arms crossed. She could see him in her peripheral vision without looking directly at him. She didn't look directly at him. Mako entered the room at the end of the lead and immediately went to the far corner. He pressed his haunches against the wall, a containment behavior, she noted, not aggression. He needed his back protected. That was specific. That told her something. She sat down in the center of the room and set the lead slack on the floor between them. She waited. There was a particular quality to the waiting that she had learned over years of doing this work, and even longer before that. It wasn't passive. It was a kind of active stillness, a decision to take up exactly as much space as you needed, and not 1 inch more, to be present without being a pressure. You couldn't perform this quality. Animals knew the difference between someone performing calm and someone who was actually calm, and they knew it faster than any human ever would. Mako looked at her. She looked at the wall behind him. He took 1 step forward. She didn't move. He took 2 more, stopped. His nostrils were working hard. She could see the fine trembling of his muzzle as he processed the information her body was putting into the air. Smell was the primary sense, and she knew what she smelled like right now. Nothing exciting, nothing threatening, whatever the clinic's soap was, and underneath that, beneath everything she could control, the specific chemistry of a body that was at rest. At the observation window, she heard Crews shift his weight. Mako heard it too. His head snapped toward the sound. The low sound started again in his chest. She said quietly, "It's okay." Not to Crews, to the dog, but it carried. Mako looked back at her. She kept her eyes on the wall. He took 3 more steps, stopped again. She could count the distance now, 6 feet between them. Close enough that she could see the old scar tissue along his left shoulder, a healed wound that had been serious once and was now just geography. She knew that scar. She had seen it happen. Her chest did something involuntary. She regulated it before it reached her face. 5 feet. 4. Mako was moving slowly now, the way a creature moves when it is following something it can't name. Some pull in the air that doesn't have a word but doesn't need one. His ears, which had been flattened since the moment she'd entered the room, shifted, not all the way forward, partway. The posture of a dog who has decided that a thing might not be a threat but is not entirely certain yet. She waited. 3 feet. His nose touched her knee. She still didn't move. He pulled back, pushed forward again. His nose traced up her forearm, over the small scar she sometimes forgot, over the bend of her wrist, and then he stopped. He stood completely still with his muzzle pressed to the inside of her wrist. And whatever he was processing in that moment, whatever the scent data was telling the oldest part of his brain, it was enough. He sat down, right there 2 feet in front of her, and he sat down. Then he dropped his head into her lap. Calamestri sat in the middle of the gray-green room with her hand resting, carefully, on the back of a Belgian Malinoise's neck, and she breathed. From behind the observation glass, Sergeant Dorian Crews said nothing for a long time. Then, what did you do? It wasn't a question. It was the sentence of a man trying to understand something that did not fit into any category he currently possessed. She looked up. Through the glass, she could see his expression had changed completely, the set jaw, the systematic eyes. All of it was gone. What was on his face now was something unguarded and almost young, the look of a person confronting something they had not built a framework for. She said, "Can you come in here?" He came in slowly, which was not what she expected from him. He opened the door, and he came in like someone entering a room where something fragile was happening that he didn't want to disturb. Mako lifted his head at the sound of Crews's footsteps, tracked him across the room, and then, instead of standing, instead of going to his handler, he lowered his head back into Kala's lap. Crews stopped. She watched him absorb that, watched him decide what it meant. He crouched down, not far from the door, and looked at his dog. "He's never done that," he said, "with anyone. He's been carrying something very specific for a while," she said. "Sometimes when a dog is carrying something that specific, they need a specific thing to release it." Crews rubbed a hand over his jaw. He looked like a man who had been certain about something for a long time, and was now standing in a room where that certainty had developed a fault line. "What are you?" he said, then seemed to realize how that sounded. "I mean, your background. You're not just a vet tech." She looked at the dog in her lap. Mako's breathing had changed. It was slower. The pacing, the circuit, the tight controlled explosion of an animal bracing against the world, all of it had gone out of him like air from a tire. He was lying against her now, heavy and warm, and she could feel the shudder that moved through him every few breaths, the kind of release a body does when it has been holding something for so long that letting go feels like falling. "I was a corpsman," she said. "Navy, 2 tours." Crews was quiet for a moment. "Where?" She stroked behind Mako's ear. "Second tour was embedded with MARSOC, Southern Helmand, then about 8 months in Kuwait." She paused. "Before I came home." MARSOC. The word came out of him differently than the others, carefully. "2nd Marine Raider Battalion," she said. "I deployed out with a Force Recon element for about 4 months of that rotation." She looked at him now. "We had a K9 unit attached to us for 6 weeks in the fall, October through November 2021. The color in Crews' face changed. "The dog's name in my notes at the time was Mako," she said. "Handler was a sergeant, Force Recon. I remember him because he was," she almost smiled, very emphatic about people not touching his dog. Crews did not say anything. "There was a compound breach in early November. I was the forward corpsman. We had 2 Marines down and a K9 with shrapnel in his left shoulder." She kept her hand on the back of Mako's neck. "I was the one who stabilized him in the field until the medevac came. I worked on him for about 40 minutes in the dark with a headlamp and the sound of secondary explosions about a quarter-mile south. He was..." She stopped, looked down at the dog, at the scar on his shoulder that she had known before she touched him. He was very scared. He was very brave about being very scared. Those 2 things can both be true at the same time. The room was absolutely silent. Then Sergeant Dorian Crews, Force Recon, who had carried his dog through 4 combat deployments and 2 years of stateside deterioration and 4 months of a silence he could not fix, sat down on the floor of the assessment room. All the way down, the way people sit when their legs have decided the conversation is over. He put his face in his hands. It lasted only a few seconds. He pulled himself back. But she had seen it, and she didn't look away because she had learned that the kindest thing you could do when someone let something show was to let them see that you saw it and that it was not a problem. "He knew," Crews said. His voice was rough in a way it hadn't been before. "He smelled you. He remembered you." "Dogs don't forget people who helped them," she said, "even years later. Even when everything else has gotten tangled up and wrong, they keep that." Crews looked at Mako. at the dog who had pressed himself into a stranger's lap and exhaled finally for the first time in 4 months. "I've been trying to fix him," Crews said. "I've been trying everything. Commands, routine, the same routes, the same schedule, everything that worked before. And he stopped." "He doesn't need more structure," Calla said. She said it gently, not like a correction. "He needs to learn that the world doesn't always go the way it went, that it can be different, that he can be somewhere safe and have it stay safe." She paused. "That takes time, and it takes someone he already trusts." Crews looked at her. "He chose correctly," he said. "Quiet. Exact. The words of a man who is used to being in charge of assessments." "He usually does," she said. She worked with Mako for 3 weeks. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, the same room, the same slate gray-green walls. The first week he still paced when he came in, but it was shorter circuits, and he came to her within 10 minutes instead of 40. The second week he went to her first and paced only after, which was an entirely different behavioral sequence and meant something had reorganized. The third week he walked through the door and lay down close to where she typically sat, which meant he had started thinking of this room as a place where a particular good thing happened and had built the expectation in before the evidence arrived. Crews came to every session. He sat in the observation area at first, behind the glass, and then at some point, she didn't track exactly when it shifted. He started coming into the room, sitting against the far wall, not interfering, just present. He was quieter than she had expected him to be after the first day. Not cold quieter, like he was listening more carefully than he had before. He asked her once, toward the end of the second week, while Mako was sleeping against her thigh with his paws twitching through something in his dream. "Was it always like this? For you? Knowing what to do?" She thought about that. About 6 years of following corpsmen who knew things she didn't, then knowing things herself, then teaching people younger than her how to manage the space between what they could fix and what they couldn't. About coming home and not knowing what to do with the particular silence of a house that wasn't going to produce any surprises. "No," she said. "It wasn't always like this. I had to learn what I couldn't control." He nodded. She had the sense that was an answer he understood in his body more than his mind. On the last Friday, Dr. Fenwick assessed Mako herself and used the phrase significant improvement in baseline affect and reduced hypervigilance index, which were clinical terms for. The dog was coming back. He still startled at loud sounds. He still preferred his back to a wall when he was in an unfamiliar space. Those things would take longer, maybe much longer, maybe forever. Some things that happen to a body change the wiring, and the wiring doesn't fully change back. But he was sleeping through the night now. He was eating consistently. He had, twice, approached a stranger in the waiting room and allowed the stranger to touch him, which was not nothing. That was, in fact, a very large thing. Crews shook Calla's hand when they left. He held it a beat longer than a standard handshake, which was the only acknowledgement he gave of the fact that this was not a standard situation. "Thank you," he said, "just that. No elaboration, no rank or formality around it." "He'll keep getting better," she said. "So will you." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had seen on people before, the expression of someone who has had a door opened in a room they thought was a wall. "I know," he said. She believed him. Later, after they had gone, Calla stood at the front window of the clinic and watched Crews's truck pull out of the parking lot. She watched it until she couldn't see it anymore, and then she stood there a moment longer with her hand resting on the glass. Dr. Fenwick came up beside her with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one without saying anything, because Dr. Opal Fenwick was 62 years old and had been reading rooms her whole life and knew when a person needed a cup of coffee in silence rather than a cup of coffee in words. They stood there together. "You going to tell me about the scar?" Fenwick said eventually. Calla looked down at her forearm, the small pale line above her wrist. She had gotten it in the fall of 2021, on a cold night in southern Helmand province, not from anything dramatic. From the corner of a supply crate in the dark while she was working on a dog's shoulder with one hand and keeping pressure on a Marine's leg with the other. She had not noticed it until 2 days later when it was already closing. "Field work," she said. Fenwick made a sound that meant she knew there was more to it and was choosing not to push. Calla drank her coffee. Outside, a car pulled in. Someone with a beagle who was walking fine but kept stopping, which could mean a dozen things or nothing. She would go find out in a minute. That was the work, going to find out, sitting on the floor, waiting, being still until something that was braced against the world remembered that not every room was the room where the worst thing happened. Some animals came back almost all the way. Some came back partway and held there, which was still back. Some just needed someone who had been in the same dark to sit with them and not make it mean anything except, I'm here, and you're here, and right now that's enough. She had spent a long time learning how to offer that without needing it returned. Mako had remembered her through 4 years and thousands of miles and everything that had happened in between. He had pressed his muzzle to her wrist and found what he was looking for, and Crews, arrogant, certain, utterly wrong about what his dog needed, had sat down on the floor of a rehabilitation room and let himself be wrong, which was its own kind of bravery. The beagle outside was pulling toward the clinic door. Calla set down her coffee and went to meet it.